So Marianne has already introduced me, so I'll just go on to the next slide and really get into what color represents for me. Um, I think for me, it's really how did color represent, or rather, really me show how color played a role in my artistic practice. As the visual artist Senga Nengudi has suggested that being born black in America is a political act, so too is my work, which navigates life in South Africa as a person of color. In other words, color is social and political, and maybe that's what I'm trying to ground with this presentation. Um, Color and fashion, I would even add to that, is even more political, as evident in this advert by Velisco. Blisco is a textile brand that is linked to the Netherlands and its exploitation of its former colony, Indonesia, reproducing wax batik textiles through machines and reselling it to the African market. Why? Because they were rejected by the Javanese people from where they were originally appropriated from. And they did this to obviously to continue through fashion and in many ways dictate how African bodies should look. And this is important because when I was a young fashion student, I really started to see how, not so much how the colonial project worked, but just how, we were being dictated to in terms of how color was always being placed on black models. And so the model that I grew up knowing very well was Alec Wack. And particularly for the yellow dress that she wore at the time that I saw her. But I thought these images that I chose here were a little bit more compelling. Um, and I really thought about how is color playing a role in me being a fashion designer. Here is another one where prints together with color have been used on models such as Elegweg to promote this idea of black bodies and color, as well as pattern. And they use the model or the tool of fashion, or the fashion industry, this idea of desire, but also this space that uses the eyes first, to dictate to the rest of the world that black equals color. And I've seen this strategy being used through many other sort of fashion shows or fashion photo shoots or magazines. And that really like kind of stirred this kind of inner sort of resistance in my practice from a very early age. So this is where I really thought about shifting my early design practice from colors to black and white. And this was a concept, sorry, this was a concept that shaped my early education in fine art at high school, which one of my teachers noted that black or white is not a color but a tone. And this really made me think about how can we rethink what African fashion and African identities look like. Unbeknownst to me, when I shifted from using colors to blacks and whites, I was creating or I was working or made a decision that became a political act. In addition to this kind of thinking, I had a close friend of mine who wrote a thesis on color in African beading and language systems. Her thesis reiterated um, the need for caution in how colors are combined, as they may transmit unintended messages. Her arguments also pushed against the concept of Africans being colorful, as I would come to learn, because when you think about the patterns and the dye techniques that were on the African continent, the colors were sourced from plants and fauna around them. Specifically in the southern regions of South Africa, the last thing you would think about, other than beading, where color would come from, would be from hide, which didn't necessarily emit a color, but there was also clay, which had a very subdued, minimalistic, a color that was not necessarily associated and not as vibrant as the ones that you would see on black bodies, associated to black bodies, or the ones that you would have seen in the images that I shared of Elegwac in the first few slides, in the first few slides. And so my practice was also influenced greatly by my love for contemporary Japanese fashion designers. At the time, it was Isimiaki Yoshi and Rei Kawakubo. And I was influenced greatly by their use of black, white, and red. And I knew that they had strong cultural references to the use of those colors. And beyond that, color or the color of black and white really pushed itself to the study of Ma, which is, as is on the screen, is an aesthetic appreciation of negative space. And this really made me think about how can we think of African clothing outside of just color? And this really made me think about if we took all the pre-colonial images of Africans and the garments that they wore, and we turned them black and white, as I like to call it, grayed out the noise of colors and patterns, what would actually come out of that? What would suggest to me would be an aesthetic that was of African sort of heritage? And so for me, it really helped me focus on drapery, folding, and wrapping as a language to really focus in on by taking out what was seen to be African and its association to color. And so this was my early interaction with this idea, with this concept of taking out the color and seeing what can I focus on, wrapping, tying, the minimalism of drapery, to achieve what would be seen as the African look. Here is one of the other performances that I did called Reinstitute in 2019. And this was basically a pattern system that was developed around the kanga, which you saw the old chief wearing. It's quite common across the country, a cloth that's just wrapped over the left shoulder and passing underneath the right armpit, as Chinua Achebe has also written in Things Fall Apart. And so I took all these references to create a pattern system, making it what we call a contemporary. And so really, this interesting how fashion really played a role in my development as an artist. I like to say there's two sides of the same coin. My fashion often became an example of the above mentioned metaphor. And this work started with my lived experience as a South African and how the politics of race did not always align with the vision of our country. And this I started to really see when I moved from where I lived in Johannesburg to Cape Town, the city where I engaged fully with this idea of the Rainbow Nation, which was also quite contradictory. Like many, I was enamored by the utopian liberal ideals of the city, especially as a creatively inclined person, where the images I saw when thinking about the city and its multiculturalism kind of brought me to the space. It made me think about, multiculturalism as being part of the fabric of the city. I agreed with that point. This is until after a year that I stayed in Cape Town. And as you can see, the irony in this News 24 caption for me was the section that speaks about livability being a key factor. It's safe to say that many people of color would ask for whom. Um, and I think that's something that really resonated with me being a fashion student or not really a fashion student. I think you're always a student, but someone who was working for Gavin Raja at the time, because we were stationed within the heart of the city. And within the heart of the city is probably where you see a little bit of the real Cape Town coming in. So you're away from the beach, you're away from the pretty houses and Camps Bay, but you really see people in the streets who do not have homes, who come from spaces that they were removed to due to apartheid's laws, the apartheid laws, due to gentrification and a recent resurgence of racial inclusionism within the city and the wider province. And so this gray blanket became a very important material or language that are starting to develop. And through the keen interest in how these blankets were wrapped around those unfortunate and who lived in the outskirts of the city, I started to experiment with making performance costumes and clothing from blankets. This was a site-specific intervention that you see in one of Cape Town's townships called Kuguletu. And I was included in this performance that was curated by Kanyisile Mbongwa. The intervention was called Performing Being Black. And again, I was really looking at how the grey blanket was being used as a form of identity by people who were living in the streets of Cape Town. So in a way, I was giving them the sense of humanity that we tend to take away from people who are seen as the downtrodden or the undesirables. And by giving that humanity, I was saying that even people who only had blankets to work with could also wrap blankets around themselves in ways that gave them identity. And so this was where I was exploring this artistic view I grew around this gray blankets and the dust mites, because essentially the gray blankets represented these people being dust mites. They became the unwanted citizens of the city. This is some digital interactions that I did have, interventions that I had. The man in the green blanket, on the 16th of August in 2012, 34 mine workers were shot down by the South African Police Service. These mine workers worked for Lonmin Platinum Mine. It was a British-owned company. And this was one of the bloodiest days during the strikes of better living, one of the bloodiest days, and it was for better living wages. Many referred to the leader of the strike, Ngcinyani Mambo Shinoki, as the man in the green blanket. This image of him by Leon Sadiki became an iconic image used by artists all over the country to commemorate the lives of the miners. The strike also became a divisive topic, particularly in Cape Town. Some saw the miners' demand as being greedy, whilst others, mostly people of color, understood their cause, specifically with the country's history of economic disenfranchisement during colonialism and apartheid. The site-specific performance that I created here was meant to encourage empathy for the miners by making the image come to life. And then by using the fashion show as a runway as a concept, we walked from 5 different points within CBD, causing a collective experience of residents in the city, seeing a man in the green blanket. The mirrors obviously was intended for people to see themselves on this image. When one is confronted with this man in the streets, their face is superimposed onto their bodies. One of the last slides, I was really looking at colonialism, the links between colonialism and constructs, and how colors are playing a role in that space. This is really looking at how, slavery and missionary activity played a role within Cape Town, and also how this would shape how Black people would see themselves. As you can see on the left is the slave tree. What was the slave tree? There's a plaque that stands in place of what used to be the slave tree. That's where slaves were sold. And on the right-hand side is where slaves were kept, including women and children. The performance called Black Tie, a missionary position, was really interesting for me. It was my master's thesis project. And it really looked at how a lot of our cultural identity was tied up in the fabrics we wore, like the Dutch rags print and shweshwe, which were given to the natives who converted to Christianity, forever changing the relationship to nakedness, gender, and our clothing. The performance also shed light on how Black male bodies have been and continue to be seen due to neocolonial tools such as the media. This performance notably looked at how masculine identities were shaped by colonialism through traditional rites of passage. As I mentioned, or I'd come to learn, suits and the British dandy became the symbol of true masculine ideals in Africa, leading to the materialism of ancient customs. And I guess we therefore became slaves to fashion. And saying basically that reference, a detail or a book that uh, Monica Miller wrote around Black dandyism. Monica Miller is the current or the recent visiting curator of the Met Gala, detailing Black dandyism across the world. The last image I would say is the performance that I also did in the city. It was a connection, or was something that developed from Black Tie, and really looked at how the process of vetting one person into becoming this idea of the British man started at high schools. And this was through, how we wore blazers as school uniform and through sports. And really looking at how, in this performance, I really looked at how Black men were shown as carrying the weight of a colonial identity and their humiliation in the process, like the figure of Christ. This was performed as also part of my MA thesis. Yeah, it was performed by Owen Manamela, who recently passed away. And yeah, thank you so much. That was just a short presentation on the work that I do with color.
There are questions from the audience?
Yes. Yes.
Or from you, Susanna? Do you have a question? We can also wrap up at the end.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I wasn't aware that Vlisco, the company you mentioned at the beginning, that I knew that they were printed, these wax prints were printed in the Netherlands, but I always thought that the motifs were had some African roots. Can you elaborate more on the tradition of the motifs and how did it come that, because I found it interesting that you understood the black and white as a form of resistance in your design practice.
I think what tends to happen, so obviously, well, what I learned was that there was quite a strong sort of influence from Indonesia, and a lot of people, men who went to Indonesia to fight in the World War, were also part of the process of bringing batik to Africa. What tends to happen with quite a few of these companies that sell textiles to South Africa is them being aware of their colonial activity and then collaborating with said Africans to create their own motives as a way to cleanse their sort of colonial histories. So a lot of it has been said that there is collaboration with Africans, yes, because there is a market that was spurred on due to their colonial activity. And that's the case with the blankets as well. There's a lot, the blankets that were used by the Basotho traditionally for, for a custom that predates colonialism, was owned for a long time by a British family until very recently, and it was the rights were bought by a local blanket producer, and that company is owned by an Italian family. And they will say both, during the time when it was under the British family's ownership and the Italian family's ownership, that they had worked with the King Mshweshwe to develop the specific iconographies. But we all know that this is all pushed towards capitalistic goals. So there is a bit of murky waters when it comes to images that are used, that are put on a fabric that Vlisco has created. I know of fabrics that are woven in West Africa using the specific symbolism, cultural symbolisms in the fabric. And a lot of the textiles are also printed by Africans. So they buy the cotton or they weave the cotton themselves and then put their own symbols. But I also know that there has been a lot of shared skills because a lot of indigo trade has come through India as well. So the East is quite a strong influence that people have written out, or the colonial sort of history has written out of history. And that is basically where my interest comes in, because I did find it quite interesting in the beginning because this was heavily marketed. Vlisco's fabric was heavily marketed as African print.
Thanks also for the question. I think this brings us right into the subject: who owns color, certain patterns, how are they connotated with culture, what does it mean, where are you exactly with it? Thank you so much. We will certainly come back to that as well. And I would like to now invite Eugenia Lau on the floor, and she will tell us interesting stories about indigo. So thank you, Lesiba. We keep in touch, and we will see you later on again.